Welcome, everybody, to the Computational Sustainability Virtual Seminar Series. We're happy to offer this opportunity for those interested in computing and sustainability around the globe. This virtual seminar series is being organized by CompSusNet with support from the National Science Foundation and Cornell University. My name is Doug Fisher, and I'm the Director of Outreach, Education, Diversity, and Synthesis of CompSusNet. During the webinar, you can ask questions through the question and answer facility or the chat window on Zoom. Why don't you look for that chat window now if you like to, and say hello to everybody. Just write a message to everyone and hit return. When you ask your question on chat or the Q&A facility, we may wait until the end of the presentation to talk about these questions, but I will try and bring them to the speaker's attention in real time if they seem important. If you want to be recognized and ask the question yourself, just say so in the chat window and we'll promote you to a panelist so you can ask your question live. Otherwise, I'll do it for you. CompSusNet has several social media outlets, including Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and the CompSusNet blog. You can find that at www.compsust.net. We regularly record these talks, and the recordings are available to URL at the center of the screen. Upcoming schedule is also available there. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Fern. Alan is a professor of computer science at Oregon State University and happens to be on the executive council of CompSusNet too. He's also an associate editor for machine learning and for the Journal of Artificial Intelligence Research. He serves on the executive council of the International Conference on Automated Planning and Scheduling as well. So Alan, if you can take it from here, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, I'll do that.
Right.
I just want to make sure everybody can hear me okay.
Yes, you're coming through.
Okay. All right, so we'll just get started. I'll share my screen. This is first time I've ever done one of these before, so bear with me for a second. There we go. So, all right. So I'm going to be talking to you today about some work that we've been working on for probably about 7 years. We got started 7 years ago, and it's the line of research that is really trying to bridge the gap between Bayesian optimization and what you experience when you try to bring that technology into labs. So another name for this talk could have been Bayesian optimization plus automated planning, because I view a lot of what we've been working on as really trying to join these two areas in different ways that come up during the research. So, you know, the way I'm going to run this talk is I'm going to have a little bit in the beginning that motivates Bayesian optimization. I'm not going to assume people are experts in Bayesian optimization, and even I'm not going to assume you know what it is. So I'll have a little bit of background on that. Then I'll take you through a little bit of the history behind our work in this area, and then I'll tell you about the most recent work that we've been doing. And so we got started on this when some collaborators here came to us with this problem in microbial fuel cell design. And what I'm showing you here is a microbial fuel cell, a schematic of it. I actually don't know a whole lot about how they work, but these bacteria are swimming around in what might be wastewater. So, you know, the dream is you could make electricity out of wastewater. And these bacteria swimming around, and somehow they, by doing that, they produce electrons, which produce electricity. Now, people have worked on this for quite a while now, and there's a lot of issues in how to make the design most efficient. How do you produce the most electricity for a given wastewater site and type of bacteria? And when we came into the project, they were experimenting with lots of different things. So you can try putting nanoparticles, different types of nanoparticles and modifications onto the anode. which somehow influences the bacteria's ability to produce electricity. They don't really understand why or how exactly. So it's really kind of a black art. And they wanted to know if there were any computer tools that could help them with these designs. And so what they can do is they can run lots of experiments, well, as many experiments as they can afford. And what we need to do is figure out what experiments they should run to optimize the power output. And this is just one application of this nature. They were also interested in hydrogen production using bacteria. And we found different other applications around campus that we're looking into as well. I'll mention some of those at the end. But really what they had been using before we encountered them was traditional experimental design practices, which are sort of one-shot designs that are basically trying to fill up the grid of the design space. And so we wanted to see if we could do anything a little bit smarter. So there are some challenges here. We're ultimately optimizing a function, right? The function is we have some design parameters and the output is the power that we get. But we don't have an analytical description of that function. We don't really even have a good simulator of that function. And let alone, we don't have gradient information. So your classical optimization approaches are out. The number of designs are obviously much larger than the number of experiments we can afford. Because these experiments they're noisy, but they're also very expensive. So you're not going to be able to run 1 million experiments here. These are actually wet lab experiments that take hours or days. So if you just look at these three things, it seems impossible, right? If the function could be anything at all, there's really nothing we can do. And so what we're going to try to leverage is the fact that similar experiments will tend to yield similar outcomes. We're going to try to leverage the fact that the function will have some structure. I think one of the labs might have just died. Not sure yet, but I'll just continue. So how can we exploit regularity in the functions to perhaps do more intelligent experiment design? And that's where Bayesian optimization comes in. So Bayesian optimization is a fairly popular technique these days. It's used in a variety of applications, including automated machine learning. And basically, I'm going to show you the basic loop of Bayesian optimization. So imagine that this is just a 2D experimental space. So we've run these experiments and they've given us outcomes. What we're going to do is we're going to then fit some posterior model of the response surface of the inputs to the outputs. So this might be the response surface, which gives us the power output for certain parameters. And an important thing about the posterior is it should capture the uncertainty that we have. So it's not just going to give us the mean estimate, but it's going to give us an uncertainty estimate. So we could compute confidence intervals at any point if we wanted to. So using that sort of measure of uncertainty, the computer then needs to select the next experiment. And it needs to do this in a way that will ideally efficiently find an optimal experiment in the space or a very high performing experiment. This gets fed back into the system. We update the posterior and the process continues. And so this is an instance of what you would call adaptive experimental design because we're continually adapting the design to the most recent experiments as opposed to classical offline experimental design where you decide all the experiments beforehand. So that's the classical Bayesian optimization loop. And what I want to do is just spend a little bit of time digging into each of these very briefly. And so we talked about this posterior model. What does that actually look like? Well, a very, very popular model in Bayesian optimization is to use Gaussian processes to model these response surfaces. And a Gaussian process is basically just a prior over a function space. And what I'm showing you here is we've got a Gaussian process prior, and this is one sample from that prior. And you'll notice that it's somewhat smooth. So the prior may and usually does indicate smoothness constraints on the function. This is another sample and another sample. And so all of these samples would be relatively likely under the standard Gaussian process prior. This type of function would not be likely because it has a lot of high frequency components. So in this case, we're thinking of a Gaussian process prior that's really valuing smoothness of the functions. Now, the really nice thing about Gaussian processes is that you can do posterior inference relatively efficiently. And what that means is that if we've observed these data points, these samples of the function already, relatively efficiently, polynomial time in terms of the number of these data points, we can get a posterior over the functions that are available under the Gaussian process. And so this is one sample from the posterior. You'll notice that it will typically go through the points that you've observed. It doesn't have to, but in this case, it is. This would be another sample from the posterior. Right? You see it still goes through the points, but the variations outside the points are different. So these would be likely samples, perhaps, if the Gaussian process is trying to reward smoothness. This would be a sample that's not so likely, right? Because it doesn't even go through the points we've observed. And this would be another sample that's unlikely because it does go through the points we observe, but it has a lot of high frequency components. So the Gaussian process gives us a nice way of computing basically the mean and the variance of any point in the space according to the prior that we set. And the prior is basically specified by a kernel, which says for any points in the space, essentially how similar they are, what the covariance is between them. And so if you have a kernel that says close by points have similar function values, that's going to give you a smoothness constraint. And a typical choice for that is going to be an squared exponential kernel. It's a traditional choice. So that's a popular choice. We're going to be using Gaussian process priors. And the question then is, if you have such a Gaussian process prior and a posterior, how do you do experiment selection? So here, I'm showing you, just focus on this top part first. So let's say that we've already observed 2 experiments. So these dark points are the 2 experiments. This is just a 1D experimental space. So we had one parameter, and this is our output value. Now the dotted line is showing you the true function, the true underlying function. And what I'm showing you with the solid line is the mean that's predicted by the Gaussian process. And this blue part is showing you the variance, or the posterior uncertainty that the Gaussian process is telling us. And you'll notice that as you get further away from the observations, the uncertainty becomes larger, which is intuitive, and that's sort of one of the outcomes of these kernels that reward smoothness. So the question then is, if we have this measure of uncertainty at any point, right? At any point we can query for the mean and sort of the standard deviation, which can give us confidence intervals. How should we select our next point for sampling? So what experiment should we run next? And there are a couple of considerations. Obviously, this is the best point we've seen so far. But you probably don't want to just sample right around this point. For one thing, you're fairly certain you're not going to get much of a different outcome around this point. And another thing, if you just sample around points that currently look good, you're not going to explore enough. So you need to be exploring in regions, but you want to make sure that you're exploring in regions that are plausibly promising, right? So that would be exploitation. So if you have a region with high uncertainty that has a very low likelihood of doing well, you don't want to go there. So the way that typical Bayesian optimization approaches sort of trade off these considerations are via acquisition functions. And so down at the bottom of this, I'm showing you an acquisition function. And I'll give you some examples in a moment, but we'll say that an acquisition function is somehow going to combine the uncertainty and the goodness of the mean at a point that's going to pick the next point to explore. So in this case, the acquisition function is identifying this as the best place. So we have this acquisition function, we optimize it, and we'll observe this experiment. We'll update the posterior, and so now you see the variance has gone down around this point. The acquisition function changes, and it says to pick this point here. And we're going to do that, and we pick this point, and we keep on doing this. And so the key idea here is that optimizing the acquisition function can be fairly cheap, right? Because this is just something we can do in the computer, whereas these experiments are very expensive. So we're going to be optimizing a very cheap acquisition function to select our experiments. So the question is, what should this acquisition function be? There are two, I would say if you had to pick the two most popular acquisition functions, it would be these two up here. So one is expected improvement. This is a fairly old idea. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to any point. Well, first we're going to say, well, what's the best experimental outcome we've seen so far? In this case, it would be this point that I'm highlighting. And then we're going to say, suppose I were to try this experiment. What's the expected improvement that I would see over the best outcome so far, right? And so there's some probability mass of getting an observation. If you try this experiment, there's some probability mass above the best point we've seen so far. We're asking, what is the expected improvement? So that's a function, that's a measure that's often used for an acquisition function. Another popular one is called the upper confidence bound, UCB. And what this is, it's a combination of the mean. So you go to a point and you say, what's the mean? And then you add on the variance multiplied by some factor. And so this is basically going to say, well, it's good to try points that have large means and large variance, or some trade-off of those two considerations. So these are the two most common acquisition functions. If I had to give advice, I would just say usually use expected improvement. That's usually what I found works the best. And the reason I say that is picking this constant value can be tricky. So this the upper confidence bound has this K value, and this proposals for how to update K as the experiments go on. But I found them to not be very reliable when you're trying lots of different functions. And just to give you a little insight.
Alan, can I ask a question? A couple of questions, actually. If you could go back a slide. So in the example you gave, where you were going to test in that region where you have the posterior uncertainty, if it was expected improvement, we would not choose that point, because in this particular example, the expected improvement would not be greater than the best we know. Is that?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say exactly. I'm showing you some intervals here, but you would have to do the calculation. And so basically, if there's a high variance, there's more probability mass above the best point.
Okay.
Here, there's a little bit of variance, and so there's a little bit of probability mass above the best point. And so
in the case of, in the case of wet experiments, is it really the case that when you do one experiment, the uncertainty at that point goes to zero, or is there still an uncertainty associated with that?
So what I'm showing you here is a Gaussian process that's assuming no noise. So if the Gaussian process had a noise term on it, then this may not, the uncertainty here would be a little larger. So if there's a noise parameter, basically these intervals will be larger and it won't be zero around the point.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, good questions. So this is something that we've got hopefully a paper coming out soon. We've done a big empirical investigation. I mean, when I was looking at the Bayesian optimization literature, it's very frustrating because you see lots of conflicting results about what's better than what, and it was very confusing. So we decided to do a fairly elaborate empirical investigation using lots of different methods out there, acquisition function based, like I told you about, and some other methods as well. And this is just one slide that shows you one example for one function, but it's actually very typical, and this was very surprising to me. EI, we found the expected improvement is really hard to beat in terms of robustness. We've tried UCB, for example, with all kinds of different options that we've seen in the literature, but for some reason it tends to get beat by EI a lot. So this could be a whole talk on this evaluation, but I would say EI is a very safe bet, no parameters, and it works reasonably well. So that would be my advice. So that's traditional BO. That's more just background. And what you notice when you start going into a lab and say, I want to use BO in your lab, you're going to see that the assumptions that BO typically makes are not really valid in the lab, at least certain types of assumptions. Let's see what those might be. So a traditional BO assumption is that experiments can be started instantaneously and accurately. In other words, if you ask for an experiment, you can run that exact experiment at that moment. Now, in reality, experiments often take is a process to set them up. And if you're not planning for that ahead of time, there may be a huge delay before you're able to actually run that experiment. And another thing we've run into in the lab, which I won't talk about today, is sometimes you don't even have the ability to ask for precise experiments. So for example, when we were working on the nano structures for the microbial fuel cell, you can't ask the folks making the nanostructures for precise structures, because making the nanostructures is sort of a black art as well. They can get you something close, but not precisely what you want. And so we studied something called constrained experiments, where we gave them ranges that we wanted. We won't talk about that today, but that's one consideration. But the one we'll be talking about today is experiments require prep work, and sometimes you need to actually plan for that ahead of time. The other assumption is that all experiments essentially have the same cost. Typically, BO approaches, Bayesian optimization approaches, are evaluated in terms of how well they do per number of experiments. And when experiments have different costs and different running times, that's not really the appropriate measure. Really, what you care about in real life is how well you do per unit time, given some resource budget. So the costs may vary. And in our experience, this comes up when different microbial fuel cell experiments require different types of bacteria. And those different bacteria take different times to prepare. And one could take a day, and another could take 2 weeks to grow and culture. So the other thing is, typically people have studied experiment at a time. So one experiment after another, you run them to full completion before you start the next one. In reality, in the lab, you often have the facilities to run multiple experiments in parallel. And so what I'm going to do is now take you through a little bit of the history of our work. I'll talk about two different things that we've done leading up to the most recent discussion that I'll talk about today. And so the first thing that we ran into was this one experiment at a time thing. And back in 2010, we were surprised that there really wasn't work on batch Bayesian optimization. And by batch Bayesian optimization, I mean selecting not just one experiment, but K experiments to run. And so we did some work on that problem. This was back in 2010. We had some work in 2012, and since then people have developed some other methods. It's worth talking about some of the concepts here, and when it comes to batch Bayesian optimization, there's trade-offs, in terms of what you can do for large batches versus small batches. And so let's look at these a little bit. So by sequential, I just mean batch size 1. We're executing one experiment at a time. And the positive thing about that is every experiment you select, you get the maximum amount of information, right? You get to use all the information from all the previous experimental outcomes. The con is, well, you're only running one experiment at a time, and so if your experiments take a long time and you have a time horizon budget, that limits what you can do. So for batches, when you're using K greater than 1, the clear benefit is that you can run more experiments per unit time, right? So that's a big payoff there. The downside is that when you're selecting your batch of 10 experiments, that batch doesn't get to use any information from the results of those experiments. So you have less information that you're using. In the limit, you can imagine picking all the experiments up front, so selecting 1,000 experiments up front. And obviously there, that seems suboptimal because you're not using any information from prior experiments. So this is really the trade-off between using a large batch size and a small batch size. But our question was, if somebody tells you the batch size, how do you design a batch that doesn't result in a lot of loss compared to sequential, right? So that's really the idea. How can you avoid doing poorly sequential? And in our NIPS paper in 2010, we had an interesting approach called simulation matching, which I think since then we've converged on a much simpler approach that works just as well, and that's what I'm going to show you here, just as a sort of tutorial. If you want to do batch Bayesian optimization, my recommendation is to do what I'm showing you here. And this has been proposed by Andreas Krauss in the past as well, with some analysis, this type of idea, as well as others. So what we're going to do, so assume that we've already observed 2 experiments, and now we want to pick a batch of 2 experiments, right? Just 2 for this example. We're going to do exactly what we did before. We're going to have an acquisition function, and we're going to pick an experiment to run, and then we're going to pretend we run it, and we're going to pretend the outcome was the mean of the Gaussian process. Okay? So we're just going to pretend we run it, and we're going to add it into the Gaussian process. We're going to pretend we observed it. And what you'll see is now the variance around that point shrinks, and the mean function of the GP doesn't change. And now we're going to do this again. We're going to select the next point, and we're going to have a fake observation and update the Gaussian process. And so what this does, updating the Gaussian process, what it does is it basically shrinks the variance around this point. And so you're not going to be likely to select points right around this. Because the worst thing you can do in a batch learning approach is to select a whole bunch of points that are essentially identical. So you need to make sure that that batch is exploring the space. And this is one simple approach to do that, and it works. I would say it works as well as anything we've tried, over the last 7 years. And so and it's very efficient, very easy to do. So this is what I would recommend. So that's batch Bayesian optimization, but it still doesn't quite get us to where we want to be, because there's still these questions. How many should we run in parallel? The lab may be able to run 20 in parallel, but do we really want to do that, right? Maybe we're better off waiting to get some observations before we make our next choices. When should we start new experiments, and which experiments to start? Those are questions that are not answered by just giving an approach for picking K experiments. So another paper, which we're not going to go into detail in here, is in 2011, this problem, which is really now starting to mix Bayesian optimization and planning, but in this case, it's really Bayesian optimization and scheduling. So in this problem, we said we have up to L experimental labs. So we could be running up to L experiments in parallel if we want. We also had a budget on the time, and we had a budget on the total number of experiments we could run. So you can think of this as you've got a grant, and you have an experimental budget in terms of money, and you have a time budget. And the question is, how do you use that time best? And so we studied this problem, and I'm not going to go into the details of this, but it was a pretty interesting combination of scheduling and Bayesian optimization with some counterintuitive types of results. Usually in scheduling, you're trying to minimize the make span, which is you're trying to minimize the time it takes to execute a whole bunch of jobs. In Bayesian optimization, you're trying to maximize that make span. So you can look at the paper if you want or ask questions later, but I'll leave that there. So that work still did not address some of the issues that we run into. So that work still had this assumption that experiments can be started instantaneously, that they all have the same cost, and basically what we want to do now is it did answer the questions of how many to run in parallel and when to start new experiments. But what we want to do now is talk about, well, what preparation activities be planning for. Okay? What do I mean by that? Well, in the lab, as I said, you can't just start an experiment instantaneously. There's prep work and there's resources that are required. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is, well, what if we gave the computer a model of the laboratory actions and resources, okay? Like we would do in any automated planning problem in AI. So the computer now understands everything that's going to be involved in running an experiment. And the computer can now try to direct the laboratory activities that are both involved in setting up experiments and selecting experiments. So this is the problem that we're going to be talking about today. So just to get into this, I said that we want to give the computer a model of the laboratory actions and resources. What exactly does that mean? Well, the resources essentially variables that we're going to be declaring. And examples of resources in a typical domain in a wet lab may be laboratory assistants, right? You need a laboratory assistant to do certain tasks. And so if you run out of laboratory assistant, you can't do those tasks. Microbial fuel cells, that's another type of resource, which may be broken down into component resources. And bacteria, in this case, which you grow glass and in culture. So those are 3 example resources that you might need. Now, how do we actually model the actions? The computer needs some model of the actions in a domain. And today I'm going to talk about 2 types of actions. One type is we're going to refer to as resource production actions, and these are more or less the experimental setup actions. And an example here would be an action of produce fuel cell. And this would involve either somebody disassembling an existing fuel cell and cleaning it and then putting it back together, or creating one from scratch. But what you need to model is roughly how long it's going to take, right? In this case, 1 hour. What's its outcome? It's going to produce 1 microbial fuel cell. And what does it require? What resources does it require? Well, it requires 1 laboratory assistant. It's going to borrow a laboratory assistant for that amount of time. Another example would be produce bacteria of type A. Maybe that takes 5 hours. It produces 3 bacterial cultures, which could be used for some number of experiments. And it's going to require 1 lab assistant, probably not for the full time, so we would have to specify how much time, because this will be sort of culturing offline. And similarly, we could have another type of bacteria. So these are one type of action, the resource production actions. The other type of action would be actions that actually run experiments. And these actions have parameters, and these are usually what we're going to be trying to optimize over. So in this case, we're optimizing over the concentration of a certain type of bacteria and the density of a nanowire. And the experiment takes around 6 hours. It consumes 1 microbial fuel cell, and it consumes 1 culture of bacteria A. And the outcome is a value Y, which is distributed according to a Gaussian process. So these are the things that we give our system, and it has to figure out what to do. So if we think about the problem, what we really have, at any moment in time, the computer has a set of resource types, the action descriptions, and then it also has the currently available resources. So we know what resources are available in the lab. And then we also have the outcomes of the previous experiments, and we have the remaining time. So at any moment in time, this is what the computer knows. And what we want it to do is output which experiment and production actions we should start right now. So it's sort of the laboratory director. You can think about it in that way. And the objective is to maximize the unknown function as much as we can within the time horizon. Okay? And so and our resources are sort of captured by the currently available resources, which could include money, right, to buy materials. So the solution approach. Well, you can model this whole thing as a partially observable Markov decision process, which really isn't saying much. You can pretty much model most problems that way. And so thinking about in terms of that generality doesn't tell you a whole lot. You need to dig into the problem to come up with more structure. But basically, if you model it that way and try to use a offline POMDP solver, it's not going to work. These are just much too large. They've got continuous state and actions. So we're going to consider, we decided to consider a tree search approach, an online tree search approach in this paper, where at every point in time, we have the information available, and we're going to be growing a search tree for some amount of time in order to select an action to do at the root. Okay, so this is like a chess engine you could think of for the laboratory. We're just choosing experiments as opposed to chess moves. And the issue is this tree is going to be big and hairy, and we have to use our intuition and experience to design a tree search algorithm that can work in practice. So let's review the state components that we're going to have. So the state components, again, are going to be our prior outcomes, the ongoing experiments. So we have some experiments that are currently running, the ongoing production actions, so some actions are currently running, and our available resources. That's what we have at the root of the search tree. And I'm going to distinguish between 2 types of states just for simplicity. This isn't really necessary, but it makes the discussion easier. So we're going to say there are E states, which are states where there are resources available to run an experiment. And then there are going to be R states where there are where no experiment can be run. This is a state, for example, where all of the probes are taken and there's no resources to run a new experiment. And for this talk, I'm just going to say we're just going to always assume that if we're in an E state, we're going to start a new experiment. It's not essential. It just decreases the tree search complexity a bit. So let's look into this tree. I'm just going to take you through what this tree looks like. And so we're at a certain time 0, We've done some stuff in the past. We've got some experiments that we've run. Some things are currently running. And this is an R state, so we don't have any experiments that we could start right now. We could possibly do some resource production, right? With the idea that, well, maybe we're out of a certain type of bacteria, and maybe that bacteria looks like it's going to be a useful thing to run experiments with in the future, so we better start preparing it right now. Right? That's how you want to think about this. So at this state, we have the actions available to us that are resource actions that we could choose from. And after taking any of those actions, time would go on, and possibly what would happen is certain experiments would end. Right? And let's say that one experiment ended. The next state will be a state where that experiment could have been in any one, and it could have resulted in any number of outcomes. So these are stochastic outcomes, right? An experiment ended, and here it had one value, here it had another value, here it had another value. And in our tree search, these are going to be distributed according to the Gaussian process. So if you're not discretizing, this would be sort of an infinite set of possible outcomes if you have real valued experiments. So after every outcome, you have then a choice to start up a new experiment. And so these actions would be experiment selection actions, and so on and so forth, building this tree. Now, the question now is, what is the value of a tree? What are we trying to optimize? We're really trying to figure out what is the goodness of each action at the root, and that basically amounts to defining what we mean by the value of a tree. And what we're going to use as the value of a tree is the expected improvement. And so we're going to let y star be the best experiment that we've observed up until time t0. And we're going to try to build this tree so that we find the action that leads to the highest expected improvement among all the choices. And the way this can be computed is sort of from the ground up. We're not going to do this explicitly in our implementation, but imagine that this action, the value of this action, is the improvement that the expected improvement that these experiments may lead to. So you could do this for every action. And then the value of this state is the value of the best action. So this is a typical sort of expect Emax tree. And at the end, you can value all the actions according to their expected improvement. Right? So apparently producing this bacteria was the most important because it let us run experiments in the future that were potentially valuable. And so we better produce that bacteria now. So the problem here, it's tree search, and it's a big tree. And we basically have a huge branching factor for various reasons. So one, let's look at the branching factors. So at an R state, we have choices of the different resource production actions. This number is typically going to be manageable. It'll be in the tens. But the potential outcomes, like the number of experimental outcomes here that adds to the branching factor, is enormous or even infinite. And so that's not manageable. And at E states, when we come to selecting possible experiments, this is also often enormous or even uncountable. And so that's not manageable either. And so we have to figure out how we're going to deal with this complexity in the tree. And you can look at the paper for details, but I'm just going to say that we're going to use a couple of approximations. So one, we're going to use the map approximation, which says this may seem severe, but this worked for us fairly well. We're going to essentially determinize and say the outcome of an experimental action is going to be the most likely outcome. This is a common heuristic in POMDP literature. Generally not sound though, so you have to be careful when you use it. You have to make sure that some pathologies don't occur. For the experiment selection, we already have good policies for selecting experiments. Expected improvement, I showed you that earlier, classical BO ideas. And so for experiment selection, we're only going to consider the action selected by one of those policies. And we could consider multiple actions, but we could have EI and UCB, but for this purpose, we're just going to have one. So at the end of the day, the only branching that we're going to have is on the resource production actions, and everything else is sort of settled. And so the complexity of this is basically, the branching factor is basically how many R states there are on any one path, and not the overall time horizon. So the final difficulty is, well, even if there's a manageable branching factor on these R states, a large time horizon will produce a large tree. And so, like any tree search, you need to cut off the search and have a heuristic evaluation function. And it's really this heuristic that was I'd say the most interesting part of our work, and that had the most novel innovations. And I'm not gonna get into the details of it, but I'll give you the main idea. So at each of these leaf nodes, we have a set of available resources and a set of resource actions that are running and a set of experiments that are running. And what we want to do as a heuristic estimate is we want to say, well, if we considered all of the things that are available here, what set of experiments could we select that consume our current resources that would lead to the maximum expected improvement? Right? So we're going to select a batch of experiments that could be run given our current resources that has the maximum expected improvement. And it turns out that this is if you're using expected improvement for our tree, this is a constrained submodular optimization problem, where the constraint turns out to be matroid constraints. So you get into the submodular optimization under matroid constraint literature. And our work was basically trying to understand what constraints on the resource production actions lead to matroids that we can sort of get approximation bounds for. So it turns out that the greedy expected improvement algorithm, you can get approximation results for this, and that all the details there are in the paper. But it turns out to be a very effective heuristic, and it's relatively efficient. So I'm going to show you some experiments. And one thing I will say is that we often in reviews for papers in this area, the reviewers will just say you need to have real world experiments. And what I think people have to realize, and you realize it as soon as you work in this area, you can't get quantitative experimental results in the real world. Because what you would be doing is, especially comparing algorithms, what you would be doing is you're asking the wet lab folks to do the whole thing times with different methods so that you can evaluate your algorithms. And they're not going to do that. All they care about is optimizing their function. So it's kind of sometimes disappointing in the sense that you can never really know how well you did in the real world. The best we can do is run synthetic experiments, sometimes with simulations of the real world. But just keep in mind, that's one of the things in this area is you can't do real world quantitative evaluation. So what I'm gonna do here is, this is just one example from the paper. So this is kind of simulating the idea of what if we had 3 types of bacteria that we were looking at, and we were trying to optimize parameters of the microbial fuel cell for those different types of bacteria. And really what we're trying to do is find the best combination of fuel cell parameters and bacteria type. So we're modeling one type of bacteria and its response surface as this function here, another type this function, and this function. So you have fundamentally different response surfaces, and we have all kinds of these functions that we experiment with. And so in our experiments, if you want to run an experiment with this type of bacteria, you're going to have that type of bacteria on hand. That's a resource. And similar with this and this. And what I'm going to show you first is, well, we've got baseline policies for selecting resources. So we can have random selection of resources. You can select to produce the resource with the least amount at the current moment. Or you could select a resource from the experiment that looks like it's the most promising, that you have the least amount of. We also have an oracle, which we developed because we know what the underlying problem is. So first, random selection. So our simulations are over 90 days, so 3 months. We're thinking summer, summer of research, and we had realistic actions, for the different production of bacteria and fuel cells and all of that. And this is the average regret, so lower is better. This is what random gives you. The oracle, like if you make what we could say optimal selections, you're going to get this performance. And our heuristic strategies basically give you these curves. And our planning-based strategy essentially is much closer to the oracle than random. So that was nice to see here. We've looked at more complicated scenarios where there are more resources involved. So you have to trade off more things, think about more things in terms of producing resources for the different experiments. For that problem, we didn't have a way of computing an oracle, so all we could do is compare against the baselines. This red curve is what we got. So you can see we're doing much better in terms of what you get after 90 days and even before that. And then we wanted to see, well, what if you were in a super high throughput lab and you double the capacity of everything? We still see that we get quite a bit of gain over random and also these basic approaches. So with that, I think just a few closing thoughts. So I've been motivating this mostly through wet lab experiments, but this is also just as interesting when you're dealing with simulation-based experiments. And I've come across scientists that are very interested in doing this. Their simulators are extremely expensive to run, and they would like ways of using their compute time as efficiently as possible. So there's very different considerations. The interesting thing is in our framework, we can model this all with actions, right? Running experiments requires a certain amount of compute time, which equates to a certain amount of money in a lot of cases. So this framework holds for both physical and simulation-based experiments. I've already sort of talked about how real-world quantitative evaluations are hard. And it's interesting to consider, are there better ways to try to convince ourselves that these algorithms are doing well, right? So all we've been able to do so far is you can use synthetic functions that are classic in the literature, or you can try to have the scientists produce some rough simulators of the system, so you get a function that may be closer to the system. But that's about all we've been able to do in terms of convincing ourselves that these are working well. And I think most importantly is thinking about other domains. We've been thinking about material design. We've been talking to people here in forestry. There's a lot of interesting things in terms of lumber treatment and processing, so making the best use out of the lumber that we have. They have some interesting labs that are set up to do experiments in parallel, so we're talking to them. Hydrogen production is something our collaborators work on. Obviously, you can talk about the robotic laboratories of the future, right? Robots running lots of experiments. I've talked to somebody recently about carbon capture, and just very coarsely inject carbon into rock formations so that it will be stored. There are many choices in terms of the pressures and the timing of that, and they're not really sure what the best choices are. And they have good simulations of these things, but they're very expensive, and so this is an interesting way to maybe try to optimize that process using Bayesian optimization on complex simulations of that process. automated machine learning, this is used a lot there. And then I'm very interested now also in, if you have a cloud and you have a function you want to optimize, which could be expensive, how do you best use those resources? Because if I say you've got $1,000 to optimize your function on the cloud and a certain amount of time, like the cloud gives you, you can have infinite parallelism, but this is a case where you have to really reason about how much parallelism you want to use given your time budget and your money budget. And so obviously I'd love to hear any problems that anyone in this community has, and we're happy to share software. So that's all I have today, and I'm happy to take any questions that are available.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Alan. There was a question from a while ago. You had sort of moved on, so I didn't interrupt you. But when you were talking about that batch selection strategy about half an hour ago or so, Johan asked whether there were any bounds on the performance of the proposed batch selection strategy.
Yes. So Andreas Krauss has a paper that talks about some bounds on that. And there's actually some, there are different types of bounds. So you can get bounds on sort of the performance of the heuristic algorithm I showed you compared to the optimal batch selection strategy. And you can also try to get bounds on what is the loss for using a batch size of k versus 1. Right, so if you use a batch size of 1, that's the optimal thing you can do in terms of number of experiments. And the interesting question is, what is the loss in terms of performance per number of experiments as you increase the batch size? And his paper has some results on those quantities. And if you email me, I can send you a link. The name of the paper escapes me now, but I'm sure you could find it on his website as well. But feel free to email me, and I'll send you a link to the paper.
Okay, thanks.
But that paper is based on UCB, and I think that's actually a central part to getting the theoretical results. And my experience, as much as I would love UCB to be the best, is UCB is very finicky. I've always got better practical results using EI. And we have really seen this in a large evaluation, so I'm more confident now today saying that. UCB has some parameters that are difficult to pick.
Okay, great.
I actually have a question related to that. And it may have to do also with the framework. If you want to use the Bayesian optimization framework, that has some computational costs and trade-offs. And I guess, UCB has been used in a more almost, free model kind of setting. Are there, major trade-offs in terms, so this is a question, so clearly you seem to prefer the expectation EI as opposed to the UCB-based
yes.
Approach, but does it may be quite dependent on the kinds of problems you are looking at, the kinds of information that you can get, and to what extent you can use a heavier framework or not, correct?
Yeah, so I think I can give you some answers there. So you mentioned the computational cost of essentially acquisition-based Bayesian optimization. And so selecting each experiment can actually be fairly computationally intensive. And that's mainly due to the counting process computation, and then the optimization of the acquisition function. Now, there are some problems. So in a wet lab environment, often that computation cost doesn't matter much. The experiments are so long compared to that selection time, it doesn't matter. In another setting, if you're optimizing experiments that are simulations on a computer, the computation time of selecting the experiment from the time of running experiments. And so that's where the computation time does matter. I would say UCB and EI, the computation time is essentially the same, almost exactly the same. What I'm showing you here is, I was thinking very much along the lines that you were. There's a whole other class of Bayesian optimization or optimization approaches based on partitioning that are basically, let's just say 1 million times faster than Bayesian optimization for selecting an experiment. And I thought there was going to be a trade-off. We did this big evaluation, and we thought, well, when the experiments are very cheap, these very cheap selection methods are going to be better than the more expensive selection method. We actually did a pretty wide evaluation and found that EI was still the best. And we looked at it in terms of optimization versus time. So given a certain amount of time, how well can they do? We looked at it for a variety of functions, variety of dimensionalities, and basically what happens is a lot of these other methods get stuck more easily. So that's all I can say. I expected very much that there would be a trade-off in these approaches, but we didn't find that.
Yeah, I guess, I the way I would put this, and in my experience across different fields, it's really always this big trade-off. I mean, I'm going to now talk about a different, maybe mention briefly another example, but it's like, in operations research, when you do mixed integer program at every node, you do these super expensive computations with, LP relaxations, etc., etc. And, sometimes you get a lot of information, bounds, etc. But other times you realize, well, maybe what you get is not really worth it. And that is the contrast, for example, with the satisfiability domain, where, you just do very, very cheap, inexpensive computations per node, then you have these gigantic trees, but then you do way, way more. So anyway, but so I find this, understanding these trade-offs very interesting, and it's interesting to see your experience that even with all considered, you still think EI is the most the way to go. So that's
yeah. I mean, so I have the same type of experience that you just mentioned in the planning area. Heuristic computation versus search tree size. And we went into that investigation. This is a paper that we haven't really published yet, but we're working on it. We went into this investigation looking for that trade-off, and we didn't find it. Very, very surprising.
Oscar asks a question online. Why not, and this goes back to the batch learning, why not generically start with a small size of batch and then slowly increase the size as you run more experiments?
So it is typical to start off with a seed set of experiments, I would say. Typically, I mean, you might as well just do a standard, small experimental design, whatever your favorite design method is, where you start off with 10 experiments. That's pretty typical to do. Then the question is, why not increase the batch size over time? I'd say, generally you want to use the smallest batch size that you can afford to use. because that just lets you exploit as much information as possible. So I always view it as you've got some constraints on your runtime, you've got constraints on the total number of experiments, and in those constraints, you want to use as much time as you can, which equates to the smallest batch size possible. It's almost that's why this is an interesting scheduling problem. It's almost the opposite of what you're trying to do in normal scheduling problems. Right? Normal scheduling, you're trying to minimize the time, right? Use as much parallelism as possible. Here, you're trying to use as little as possible so that you can exploit information. So I don't know if that helps with the question. I'm happy to follow up if there's a follow-up question.
I'm guessing there's important assumptions behind that answer, and if you vary those assumptions a little bit, you might have a different response as to how you would vary the batch size.
Yeah, but I would still stand behind, the best thing you can do is minimize the batch size until you become unhappy with that size, because
right.
You just want to use as much information in every choice that you can.
Okay. I think, Warren, do you have a question?
He's muted. Warren, you are muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah,
okay, sorry. Ellen, it sounds like you and I have been running in parallel for a while. So my lab is focused on the knowledge gradient, but knowledge gradient and expected improvement are close cousins of each other. They're both value of information policies, which is a one-step look ahead. So in the one-step look ahead space, we found that when you have a concave value of information, these can be very effective, but not so much with noisy experiments. So for example, we did a project with nanoparticles, nanotubes, where we would have a success, failure outcome. So a binary outcome is very noisy, and the value of information from one experiment is extremely low. So a one-step look ahead actually doesn't work very well. So I understand your experiments and your comparisons, but I will just, as a word of caution, this is a little dependent on your problem assumptions. But I have also found your same result with the UCB policies. So UCB I put in the class of policy search. I specifically call them cost function approximations, and they have to be tuned. And tuning is hard. And if you don't tune them well, they're not going to work well. And if you do tune them well, they're fabulous because they work really well once they're tuned. The problem is tuning. And you called that the K or the kappa factor. Yeah, it's really hard to tune these, but if you can get them tuned, boy, they're great. But the look-ahead policies, especially when you have a physical resource as you do, and we ran into the same thing for the same reasons. The lab is complicated. You have setup equipment. And once you put in a physical resource, you're going to need a look-ahead, and you're going to need a more than a one-step look-ahead. So it sounds like, and so we've also been going down the Monte-Carlo tree search path as well. Be interested to compare notes.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't aware that you're working on this sort of thing, so I will definitely start reading.
I'll follow up with some emails. I'll send you.
That'd be great. So I would say just to add on to what you said, most of our experiments have been done. They have noise, but it's a relatively small amount of noise. And what we found is when we're working with a scientist, they just refuse to run a single experiment. They usually want to do at least triplicates or five of any single experiment, because that's just what they're trained to do. And so usually what we feed into the Bayesian optimization is the average of those experiments. And
yeah, I've run into that with scientists. I think we have to learn to untrain them, because I think a lot of wasted time. I mean, we also work with experiments where there's noise, but it's not very big. Yeah. And, if you've got, say a 20% noise term, you don't have to run 5 times. I think you and I both know this.
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of practical experience with large noise settings. In the small noise setting, I've found that just doing a look ahead on value of information or EI has very diminishing returns. Like too much doesn't help a lot. That was our experiments, but maybe that was the noise setting that we were looking at.
So if I could switch gears, Carla, to one of your more computational sustainability settings, you could have something where you're looking at, say, animals being killed, and the number of animals that are killed is a fairly small number, and so it's kind of random, and it's often 0 and sometimes 1 and maybe 2. So that would be a high noise setting. So if you're saying, hey, we're going to do this in order to cut down on the number of animals being killed by some particular practice, that would be a high noise setting. So it doesn't take much to change to get into that high noise arena.
Yeah. So that's a good point. I'll just say most of our work has been in the low noise setting. I have little experience with the high noise setting.
Yeah, as a general comment, Alan, this was a super fascinating talk, and you covered a lot. And I mean, I'm super excited. Clearly, it is very relevant across different domains. And Warren already mentioned that he's also working in similar problems, and I think this is really part of our computational sustainability effort is really lifting and identifying these cross-cutting computational themes across different problems. I am even more interesting because we actually have a domain where we are working on the techniques for accelerating materials discovery for solar fuels and other materials. And I think we should talk it's very exciting. We are designing experiments for the synchrotron, etc. So we have a lot in common, and it would be good to continue these conversations, maybe obviously offline. But I thought this talk was great. You went from NIPS, ICML, ICAPS, and AAAI, and this is exactly the asset. I think that's what's exciting, that you are bringing together all these different areas and in very meaningful, very exciting applications that even that I think there's some sometimes courage not to just do the sexy applications out there. So I think this was awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I thought these were pretty sexy applications.
Sorry?
I thought this was pretty sexy applications.
No. They are. I think they are. I think they are way more than, I'm not going. There are, sometimes the computer science are now investing a lot in other, obviously, more popular, but this is the future, and I think this is really super, super exciting. And CompSysNet, I think that we all are doing very exciting stuff, and that's part of a unifying thing for us. And this is awesome.
Well, thanks so much, Alan, on that. Let's thank Alan one more time, and we will send him.
All right, thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao.